This here...
Richard Serra has been acknowledged by the art world as one of our most innovative sculptors. The New York Times called him, quote, probably the most original and significant sculptor of his generation. In his evolution as an artist, he has created works with torn rubber, propped lead, and finally steel. Along the way, he produced a series of films, each focused on the artist performing one simple task, such as catching a piece of lead. Many may know Serra for his tilted arc, which sparked furious debate in the 1980s. He is perhaps one of the most dynamic artists working today. We began this hour with Richard Serra at the Gagosian Gallery, the site of his most recent exhibition. If I went back to the very beginning of Richard Serra's life, what would be the earliest thing that I found that might suggest who he is today?
Probably a little kid walking along the beach for a couple of miles, turning around, walking back, looking at his footprints, and being amazed that what was on his right in one direction, when he reversed himself, was now on his left, and it was completely different, and it startled him, and he never got over it.
He was how old?
4 or 5.
Yeah. On the beach?
On the beach.
This is San Francisco?
Yes.
And what was it? I mean, looking back now, even though you wouldn't have captured the profundity of it at that time.
I think certain things stick in your claw, or they stick in your imagination, and you have a need to come to terms with them. And spatial differences, what's on your right, what's on your left, what it means to walk around a curve, looking at a convexity and then looking at a concavity, just asking fundamental questions about what you don't understand. Those things have always interested me.
You are, don't be modest, judged to be one of our best, if not our best sculptor. What's the connection between the talent you have and what it was naturally that made you want to look at those footprints?
Curiosity, inquisitiveness. Then I used to draw every day, and I used to draw in order to please my parents, because my brother was taller and bigger and stronger. And in order to capture my affection of my parents, really to compete with my brother, I would draw every night after dinner, and my parents would encourage that drawing. So drawing for me became another language, and it became a language that was a key into the world. It kind of mediated a reality for me. So I've been drawing since I was 4 years old, and my parents encouraged it, and encouragement kind of breeds confidence.
Did you have a natural talent?
For drawing, yes, always. I remember when I was in the 2nd grade, and I'm about 7 years old, the teacher had my mother come to school because she had pasted my drawings all up around the walls for other people to see and for the whole school to see. So it was something I had a facility for.
And she said to your mother, look, this is something that needs to be nurtured?
Yes, and my mother immediately started dragging me to museums. And my mother didn't introduce me as Richard. My mother used to introduce me as Richard the artist, which I was very embarrassed by.
Well, yeah, this could do something to you if you're not careful.
No, and because of that, I thought I would major in English language, and I did. I majored in English, and I thought drawing was something that I could always do, and I would find my way into it. And eventually what happened, I went to the University of California, and then I transferred to Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara was a marvelous hotbed of intellectual activity. Isherwood was there, and Niebuhr, and Margaret Mead. And I sent 7 drawings to Yale after majoring in English literature. And Yale accepted me, saying, we think we could teach you something. And because I hadn't been painting up to that point. And that was a big breakthrough in my life. They made me get their undergraduate art history degree. And then I stayed 2 more years and got an MFA, an MA and an MFA.
The acceptance by Yale did what?
Well, I was thrown into a group of students, and a couple of them here are still in New York painting very well, Bryce Martin, Chuck Close, a lot of really famous people at the time, and we were all young art students from all over the country, thrown together in a very, very competitive atmosphere with terrific professors. And up to that point, I could take education seriously, but not that seriously. I'd never pressed that hard, and Yale really challenged me, and I think it brought out the best in me.
By that time you were thinking sculpture or painting?
I was a painter.
You were a painter still?
But basically I was still making drawings, and I had learned how to translate drawing into painting, and I was looking at those people who I thought I could learn more from than anyone else at the time, namely Pollock and de Kooning. And I think what students do is they emulate those people who are on the scene. But then I had very, very good teachers come in at the time. Frank Stella was just a little older, Rauschenberg, Philip Guston, Ad Reinhardt.
But there was this other event also in your childhood. Your father takes you somewhere
takes me to a shipyard.
To a shipyard.
Where he's working.
Where he's working as a, what, welder? Or
no, pipe fitter.
Pipe fitter. And you see...
He takes me to the launching of a ship that he's worked on. And
because he's proud.
He's proud. And it's and it a little frightened me because it's so enormous. It's like a skyscraper on its side.
Yeah, laying over like this.
Yes, and it's obdurate, and there are thousands of people there, and there looks like there's going to be a celebration, but it's also a moment of high anxiety because they undo the shackles and the dunnage, and all of a sudden this enormous object is going down a chute at a fairly increasingly rapid speed, and it hits the water, and when it first goes into the water, the bow goes under and the stern lifts, and there's like an apprehension that it's not going to make it, and then it raises and it's adrift and it's afloat, and people are celebrating and there's foghorns, and to me that was a transformation. It was like an object can become something light, that amount of tonnage could become something lyrical, and the approval during the war of seeing a ship being launched, there was something that I'd never gotten over it, and so it became a reoccurring dream for me. It still is.
Dream?
It still is.
A dream?
A dream.
And there is a direct line between that and this.
Well, causalities are hard to really pinpoint in terms of saying this caused that, but certainly it's something that...
interest.
I think there's a connection. How one would make it is difficult to ascertain, but for sure. And I've always been interested in the sea, and nautical building, and engineering, and math, and a love for drawing, and a certain inquisitiveness about things I don't understand, and a playfulness. I think if you want to make art, at some point you have to suspend judgment, and you have to involve yourself with play and not worry about the outcome. So I do a lot of playing with modules in my studio until we decide exactly where to take the play. And I think for an art student, and that was one of the great things about Yale, they really had a free play period. And play that isn't about what's foreseen, it's about what's unforeseen. And I think a lot of what art does is teach us to see in unforeseen ways, in new ways.
After Yale, you went to Paris?
Yeah, on a Yale traveling fellowship.
Looking for...
When I went to Paris, I had never seen Brancusi. And so I went to Brancusi's studio almost every day and made drawings. And I happened to have arrived there at the same time as a very good composer here named Philip Glass.
Yes, yeah.
And every night after dinner, we would go into the La Coupole and watch Giacometti would come in. And we became groupies. We would sit across from him, and he had, you know, plaster in his hair. And up to that point, existentialism was something that I could understand intellectually. And even though I'd been in front of Rauschenberg and Johns and Guston, and I understood what process art was, the idea of someone giving all to himself and then eradicating it, and giving it all to himself and eradicating every day, the stance that Giacometti had taken at that point in his life, and he was probably very old, was empowering. I think in a strange way what's happened in this country right now, I think once again we're in an existential moment. I think because of the recent terrorism, it's put people very much in the moment, and very much about resolutions in the moment, and very much about thought in the moment, and not about foreseeing what the outcome's going to be, but really living in the moment. And I think the Parisians, you know, because of the invasion in France, certainly Picasso and Giacometti had understood that, and Sartre saw in Giacometti's work that kind of existential angst and that believability in creating something in the moment. So I would say at that point Giacometti and Brancusi were very, very empowering for me, and I was an art student who was dealing in painting.
Yeah.
I hadn't started making any sculpture. So I went to Italy, and rather to make sculpture, I started experimenting in live and dead animals. I really wanted to get away from my origins. I think origins in terms of where you're born are very important, but I think academic origins can be an enormous constraint. So I really started to be very, very playful, started to really stuff animals and deal with live animals. And I had a show in Rome of live and stuffed animals when I was in my late 20s. And they closed it down. They said, ignuble, bruta. And then they opened it up again. And a year later, there was a whole movement that kind of came about in Italy called Arte Povera, where people started using sticks and stones and rags, and a person even had a show of live horses. But it allowed the scene to regenerate. And I think the thing about art history that's interesting is art history is not predictable. It's not linear in that way. Unexpected youth will always change the course because they'll always transgress those people who have come before. And that's why art remains vital. because you can't predict what young people are going to do.
But what was essential for you was just the sheer freedom. I mean, you could be playful with animals, and you could do...
The need for me was to individualize myself, to really find a way of making and doing and seeing in the way that other people hadn't done.
But was
before.
this a judgment against painting for you?
It was a judgment against everybody, anybody and everybody who had come before. I think you have to be brash in that way, not to be a rebel for rebel's sake, but to understand that if you're really going to individualize yourself, you have to take yourself out of the set way of seeing. I also understood that it was student work. I also understood that it was experimental. I never thought of it, and I still don't think of that work as being art. But I understood at that time a great need for me to start experimenting in other materials. So when I came back to New York, there was a warehouse, I lived downtown on Duane Street, that was emptying out the rubber onto the street. I phoned the head of the company, and I moved in a couple of 100 tons of rubber into my loft with people in the neighborhood. And that...
A couple of...
100 tons.
Of rubber.
Of rubber into my loft. And that became my materials, like getting a grant, and started experimenting with rubber. Now, if you think, rubber has a certain flexibility. One of the first pieces I did is I took a sheet of rubber, maybe 3 feet wide, or 1.5 feet wide, 3 or 4 feet long, and lifted it up. And I called it 2 lift. Well, it was self-supporting. So it had an interior and exterior that was the same. And what I did then is I wrote down a verb list: to roll, to cut, to fold, to bend, to sever, to drop, to twist, to dapple, or whatever. And I started enacting those activities, to roll or to twist or to hang or to prop, in relation to materials, whether they be rubber, which then led me into lead because it had a certain flexibility, and that led me into then propping. And I took 4 lead sheets and I propped them up like a house of cards. And it was a ton of lead. And I was on the 6th floor. I was a little worried if it collapsed it was going to go through the building. I was married at the time. My wife came to see that and said, "Richard, that's not art. You can't show that." And I think within a year we were divorced. I mean, there is a certain point where you, not certainly because of that, she was an artist also, but I think there's a certain point you really have to decide that if you want to redefine what you think the nature of sculpture is, you have to step outside of the dictates of the language.
But you didn't think that that was what you were doing.
I certainly did think that.
Did?
Certainly.
You were redefining the nature
of sculpture.
Of sculpture.
When I put up
you were how old?
About 28, 29. Look, you have to understand, I wasn't bogged down by the academism of sculpture. There was nothing for me to lose there. I knew the history of painting, and after seeing Velázquez, I knew I wasn't going to be able to challenge Velázquez.
Yeah.
But after seeing Brancusi and Giacometti, and I don't want to sound too brash, I thought I had a shot at it.
A shot at what?
Changing how we perceive, bringing another meaning to perception.
It's interesting to me that in a sense you wanted to do something big, clearly. You were not satisfied with being in some incremental change in any art form.
I was in analysis, and I told my analyst I wanted to be the best sculptor in the world, and he said, "Richard, calm down."
Do you think you are?
No, I think that changes year by year.
Does it?
I think it changes decade by decade. I think you do your work, and if you're lucky, an audience will follow your work, but I think you have to be able to sustain your work for a good 30 or 40 year period.
But the 90s was a great decade for you, or not?
A great decade in that I think the audience has responded to my work in a way that it hadn't before, but I've been making, I think, very consequential work for 30 years now.
Okay. By then you knew you wanted to be a sculptor, and you wanted to be the greatest sculptor.
After the House of Cards. Before then, I had things on the floor, and I had things on the wall. And they were still dealing with the pictorialism. If you look down, it's like a figure against the ground. If you look at a painting, it's a figure against the ground. I really wanted to deal with the idea of a volume in space. And then I wanted to be able to open up that volume and walk into it and through it and around it. I can tell you how the break after the House of Cards really occurred. Jasper Johns asked me to build a splash piece, a leaden splash piece in his loft. And I went there and I was heating up some lead, and I took one of the pieces of lead and I put it into the corner because I wanted to use it as a template to splash against. And I realized that the lead plate, which was only about 1 foot high and 4 feet long, when wedged into the corner and bisecting the corner, would freestand. And I thought, isn't that curious? Once that happened, I thought, if I took this plate, an 8 by 24 foot plate, and wedged it into the corner, it would probably freestand. So I had to drop the idea that I was going to handle it myself, and I had to go get riggers, and I had to get cranes. But I had worked in steel mills as a kid. So that idea of taking a big plate, 8 by 24 feet long, and wedging it into the corner and having it freestand was pretty much unheard of, because sculpture, for the most part, was still leaning on painting. People were still cutting out shapes and welding them together. So even if you look at the best of Picasso and the best of Calder or whomever, it still looks like 3D painting. No one had ever dealt with the problem of how steel was really used in the Industrial Revolution, how it was used for its stasis, its weight, its counterbalance. And I had worked as a kid not only in steel mills but around steel, so I knew its potential. And it was like, for me, going to the paint store. For me to go order up a few tons of lead or of steel wasn't a problem. It wasn't problematic.
But do you believe that if you hadn't had that experience, you might not have ever done?
For sure. For sure. If I hadn't come from a working class background, if I hadn't worked in steel mills, it would have never happened.
It gave you something no one else had. The capacity to understand the raw material.
The potential.
And the potential of weight.
Weight and mass, counterbalance, gravity. And that means that the notion of the object, or the specificity of the object as art, was pretty much over for me. I really wanted to get into the expanded field of having people walk into and through and around. Now, sculpture hadn't done much of walking into, through, and around. That was the provenance of architecture. Right. So how do you deal with sculpture where you walk into and through and around and avoid architecture? Maybe I can make space as much part of the content as the material, the steel, which is a vessel just to trap the space. So space, as my work evolved, really became my subject. The steel right now, even though I know how to articulate it, know how to bend it, and I even know how to make it look very flexible now, is just a vehicle to make the spatial experience one that people understand.
For a closer look at the work, we asked the artist himself to walk through his exhibition. 2 of his spirals, 2 forged pieces called Ali and Fraser, and works with toruses and spheres, which is his current focus.
This piece starts out with a movement that's closed, and as you walk it, it opens, then it leans to the right, and then leans to the left. This piece is called Sylvester, who was a critic in London for about 50 years, probably the most influential critic after the Second World War. And in the last 5 years of his life, we became great friends, and he passed away recently, and I dedicated this piece to him. This piece is more gracious than Bellamy in that the movement through the passage is more generous, and the opening space is much more cylindrical than oval. The other piece, Bellamy, is much more compressed and has a very, very tight elevation as you move through it. And actually the movement seems to propel you through it. This one you become much more implicated in the feeling of light, and this one has a much more gracious volume, much more of an amphitheater kind of effect in the inside. And this piece probably throws you off balance, or you don't lose your coordinates as much as you do in Bellamy. From here, the outside looks more like, say, the prow of a ship. To give you some idea of the decentering, I think it would be best if we just walk through this piece and shoot upward at the sky, and you'll have an idea of what happens to the outside of the curvature of the plate. On these pieces, it's also very difficult to know when you're on the inside and what's the outside. Here we're on the inside of the outside, but we're also on the outside of the inside. Space has become my subject, and it's basically what informs how people think about what I'm doing. The steel is kind of a way of holding the space, or directing the space, or compressing the space, or allowing you to feel the grasp of the space. So the steel and the space, or the object and the void, become one and the same. So I don't think of space as being something apart from the condition of sculpture. It's one and the same. Basically, that is my subject. I use steel to organize space.
Ali and Fraser.
Oh, 2 big figures for me. These are big weights, and they're obdurate, and they're different. And in mass and in volume, how do these pieces ever so subtly displace the volume of the room? The rooms are identical, but the pieces are different in scale and in measure. So you have to go from one room to the other to make that comparative. Whether one finds that an interesting proposition or not, I don't know. But it interests me.
Union of the torus and the sphere.
The way this piece functions, if you think of a donut, basically what you have in a donut is an inside section and an outside section. The inside section of a donut is a torus, and so is the outside section. But the inside section functions a little like a ring. If you took a ring on your finger and you bent it back on itself, basically what you'd have is something that turns in two ways. Something like that, torus, and something like this, a sphere. The interesting thing about both this torus and the sphere coming out of the same donut is that they share the same radius. And because they share the same radius, you can lock them together. One joint, same radius, two different forms. If you take the pieces in the other room, what I've done is taken 3 toruses and 3 spheres and juxtaposed them and made 5 spaces in between which you can walk through, each of which functions differently in terms of its compression, in terms of its elongation, in terms of what it evokes. Yeah, all these pieces, because of their curvature, freestand. And if you walk through them, you can see the light, because the floor is uneven, you can even see the passage of light that comes underneath them. All of them make different kinds of compression and elongations of the spaces. Some are made up of 2 toruses, some 2 spheres, and one a combination of a torus and a sphere. These modules are exactly the same as the piece in the other room, which locks together. If you think about it, if you took a sphere and just turned it around, put it right up against here, you'd have the piece in the other room. The piece in the other room freestands as do these pieces. I like that piece a lot, but if you ask any artist, he'll probably tell you he likes the last word he's made the best.
For Serra, some of his greatest intellectual battles have concerned the distinction between architecture and sculpture. For better understanding of this and Serra's process, we went to his home and studio in downtown New York. This is where his pieces began, in the model-making stage.
This one was in Venice. This one I like a lot. It's called Left Right. This was up in Venice this year. And this one just has 2 movements, right? Just this way and this way, but it was one of the more abstract ones we built.
How significant in the history of sculpture do you place sculpture coming off the pedestal?
Oh, enormous. Probably the biggest thing that happened in the 20th century. Because once it got off the pedestal, you no longer looked at an object that was depicting a realistic aspect of either a hero or something to idolize or something to worship or something to be seen as apart from the space you're in. Once it came off the pedal, it was in exactly the same behavioral space that you were in. So you had to deal with it in relation to time and space, not as something removed from you to deal as a kind of icon of worship. Basically, once it came off the pedestal, it bracketed Europe, and it bracketed the Renaissance, and it opened up possibilities that had been unforeseen in sculpture. And there were a group of people who were pushing on the edge of those potential. So there was a movement among a group of people, some older, some younger, who were very interested in the notion of process, time, and space in relation to an open field.
And all of that resonated with you?
Well, I was right in the middle of it. The difference is, if you think of a Cézanne, you look at the painting, and the subject matter of the painting is the apples or the still life. Here, the subject matter became the person walking through. So it reversed how one had looked at art, where the looking became the subject, and the subject became the person, and that person's behavior. That not only takes it off the pedestal, but it puts the responsibility of the content on how willing the person is to engage the dialogue with himself in relation to time and space and what's in front of him.
Where's beauty?
Beauty is kind of like a notion that's very, very hard for me to understand, in that it seems to be something that people lay over any given historical period, and the criteria always seems to be behind the times. I think, for the most part, artists don't get involved with beauty. They get involved with the language of art. They get involved with trying to extend the language of art. And if beauty happens, it's a residue of their involvement in the particularities of what they're trying to accomplish in terms of communicating something to someone else. The public may have some notion that artists are up to making beautiful things. But if you talk to artists seriously, that's not what they're up to.
They are up to, in your words?
Extending the language of art in the best way they know how, and to fulfill the assumptions they have about what the aspirations of art can be.
But is art about making you think?
For sure. Basically, to see is to think, and to think is to see. And it's a different kind of language, but that seems to be the function of art. To change meaning through perception, not to change meaning through beauty. To say beauty seems to be like a very criteria of slippage. It's very difficult to know what one means by that, unless you're being sold toothpaste, and then they can tell you which is the better brand, or cars, and they can tell you which is the better brand. But that all comes through a serial criteria that we've been spoon-fed. You know, artists are certain kind of ghettoized by commercialism. So to break that mold and to deal with other potentials for sculpture takes another kind of aspiration. It's not just about steel, it's about the aspiration for the potential of sculpture. So you have to get out of the commercial constraints. I was very lucky in that I had a dealer named Leo Castelli, who I was able to go into $500,000 in debt, and he would keep supporting me. I thought if I went out, I'm ahead of the game. And he would keep funding my work because he liked what I was up to, and he liked me, and he liked the work. And he never had a chance of selling any of it. Because of him, I was able to advance my work in the potential for my work with no sales forthcoming. That was like an extraordinary gift for me. I mean, he helped me more probably than anyone.
Do you think he understood you, or he did it on his own sense of what?
He liked my aloofness.
Did he?
Yeah, that's what he said to me one day. He liked the fact...
Aloofness?
He liked me. He liked my attitude, he liked my spirit, and he always said he liked my aloofness. And I think he liked my aloofness in relation to him. Because he used to say, Richard, make me a small piece that I could say. I'd say, Leo, shove it. And he'd laugh.
Is there any insecurity about you?
Oh, sure. I'm as vulnerable as the next guy.
Just, that's it, just vulnerable as the next guy.
Yeah.
When did you know, was there a breakthrough point in terms of gathering speed, in terms of traction, in terms of saying, understanding is like peeling an onion, but something where you made a statement and you knew, not anybody else, you.
You never know. I mean, basically what you do is you reflect in the mirror, and your reflection in the mirror is a lot of other people's reflections also. So what gave me a great confidence is people who I really respected, and I was nowhere, respected my work. So very early, Jasper Johns asked me to build a piece for him. Judd, who was a very, very accomplished sculptor, took me under his wing. The older artists in the city responded to my efforts even though they were not commercial, and they liked what I was up to.
What's the happiest time for you? Is it planning it? Is it going there and installing it? Is it when you can say, it's done?
It's all of it. It's from its inception to its completion to its extension into the world to its final placement to its moving it. It's all of it. It's all of it all the time. You have a body of work that you're responsible for. You try to delegate as much as you can, but I have a very small crew, but you try to do as much as you can, and I have a marvelous wife who helps me. I have very great people working with me. If you ask me what aspect of it is really fulfilling,
yes,
probably when the works are finally built and I go look at them the first time they come together, probably then, but sometimes before, sometimes in a breakthrough with a model it happens, probably in the model making stage.
Probably.
Yeah, because in the model making stage you decide that that's what you're going to go with, so you have to go through, we're trying to build a piece for Toronto here, we've got about maybe 10 or 12 models right now for Toronto Airport, and finally when we get the one that clicks in that we know we have it, we'll know. And
we, you say?
Alan Glatter and myself.
Right. Take me to one historical moment. You're going out to look at a site for Pulitzer in St. Louis. Where?
I've come from Japan.
You've been influenced by the Zen Gardens.
And
because?
Because they're about walking and looking in time and space, and they're not about an object. They're about a field. So if you go to Ryoanji and there's 7 rocks, you don't look at the rock as a specific thing. You walk along a viewing portion, one rock is hidden behind the other rock, or you watch the sun go up and down. But in most of those gardens, you walk in curvilinear paths, and things appear and disappear. So it's not about the containment of one object. It's about the notion of time, space, and movement being simultaneous. The notion of an open field, of walking through, into, and around, of things locating themselves in space that were barometers for seeing through and into the space, that became really paramount for me. So when I came back to build a piece for Pulitzer, I had to deal with 3 or 4 acres of land and find a way of dealing with the elevation rises and falls and holding a view, a meaningful view of that landscape as you walked it that would be comprehensible to a viewer. So things weren't just indiscriminately placed. That being my first landscape piece probably remains still one of the most abstract pieces I've ever done, maybe one of my best efforts, and one of the best clients I ever had. They gave me an enormous opportunity to come up against the best of their collection, which was Matisse, Monet, Picasso. I mean, and
good company for...
Well, for a young kid, I went there once and I saw the 1907 Woman in Yellow by Picasso. I walked outside, sat on the lawn, had an anxiety attack and started sweating. That's absolutely true. Yeah. And I had never had an anxiety attack. It wasn't only because of the work, it was because they were asking me to build a work in relationship to those pieces on 5 or 6 acres, 3 or 4 acres of land. So they were offering me an enormous opportunity.
Did you ever think about architecture as something that interested you from a professional point?
No. There's too many constraints in architecture. I lived with architects at Yale, so I knew what they were up against, and I wasn't particularly interested in plumbing.
Plumbing? Plumbing.
Plumbing. Architects have to deal with a whole host of functions that are non-aesthetic. You see, I think we're in a time right now where the architect kind of rules and the art is kind of a sideshow that comes and goes in the museum. So the architects have become the high priests.
The building is more important than the art.
That's what happened in the recent decade.
And they're all building museums.
And they're all building their churches.
Yes, and the new church.
Yeah, and the art is kind of a sideshow, and the directors are more interested in the property and the turnstile than they are the art. But my belief is art will take care of itself. And artists will find a way into and through and around that situation, and they'll be critical of that situation, or they'll misuse that situation in a way that exposes that situation for what it is. But right now, there are some directors that really have a stranglehold on the situation where the art just becomes the hamburger and the McDonald's, and that's unfortunate.
But if you look at your art today, and the art you've done over the last 10 or 12 years, you have probably been more inspired, in one case, by one church. True?
I mean, if you're talking about the ellipses coming out of San Carlo by Borromini,
right.
if that's what you're talking about, that's true, but it's only true because I was interested in those problems when I walked into that church. And what was there was a dome that was vertical straight up like this. And I walked in on the side aisle, and I wanted to torque this dome. I wanted to make it at a right angle to the piece on the floor. And I didn't know if it was possible to do that. And I phoned an engineer that I worked with at Frank Gehry's office named Rick Smith. And he said, Richard, you can possibly make a steel vessel surround 2 given voids, but we can't play with you right now because we have to deal with Bilbao, the museum that Frank was building at the time. So I said, all right, I'll do it myself. So I took 2 pieces of wood, and I put a piece of wood like this and a dowel in between, and put a piece of wood like this at a right angle to it. And then I took a piece of lead and I put it on the floor. And I rolled this wheel, so to speak, around the lead. Now, if you remember, when you were a little kid and you had a bicycle or a tricycle and the back wheel broke, and one was at a right angle to the other, the line that the back wheel would make in the snow would be something, this is an exaggeration, or in the mud, would be something like this. Well, that gives you an idea of what the template would be that surrounds this form. I didn't know that. So after I made this model, I unfurled it, and I had a sheet of lead that looked like this, and I sent this back to the engineer. Up to that point, that had not been done in the history of form making. It had not been done in architecture. It doesn't occur in nature. It simply doesn't occur.
See, that's the amazing thing.
It's a little minor invention, but minor.
Yeah, but I find that amazing. I mean, is it just me? When you look at an ellipse, it doesn't occur before in sculpture.
It never occurred where the exact same form rose in elevation, torqued on itself, and the radius stayed the change. I was actually in France, and I was talking to an engineer, and he said it can't be done. And I said, go home and make it with paper yourself. Sure, it can be done. In order to finally get it made, we had to send out all over the world. I went to Korea. They could probably make it, but they didn't make steel plate large enough. And finally, we found a place here in Sparrows Point in near Baltimore, a shipyard there. And the first plate that we put in, they assumed that they were two cones in relation to each other that they could process as cones, and they broke the first plate, which was 40 feet long, 2 inches thick in half. And then we had a show coming out the D, and we had to postpone it for a year because we weren't sure we could even get them built. So that was difficult. Building the first three ellipses, that was a very long haul, maybe 3 years.
I mean, that seems to be a crucial turning point.
It was a breakthrough for me.
Breakthrough's a better word.
But I didn't know that the response was going to be what it was, because right before that I was making conical shapes, and I was making, I thought, interesting work. I wasn't making contained spaces that you could walk into. I think Borromini challenged me to do that, if anything. And we had no idea what the response was going to be, none.
And what was it?
People responded in a way that they hadn't really responded to a lot of my work previously. I came in one Sunday, I came down from Cape Breton, and people were sitting inside the pieces. I thought, that's strange. People were using the pieces in a way they hadn't before. I don't mean using functionally, I mean using in terms of their own time. They were spending time with these pieces. They were walking through them. They were going back to them. They would leave and come back the next day. I saw something that almost broke my heart. A woman got out, wheeled in a wheelchair, had someone stand her up, and walked around one of the pieces, put her down in the wheelchair, and moved her into another one. Wow. Philip Johnson came in and tried to touch the walls as he walked around the pieces and completely got blown out. Little things like that, and I'm not patting myself on the back, gave me a great deal of satisfaction, because people were into dealing with a spatial experience that they hadn't dealt with before, and they were getting something out of it.
And the critics liked it.
Yeah, yeah. You can't go too much on that. Sometimes they like it for the wrong reasons, sometimes, I mean, I suffer a lot from what critics say, but... You
suffer?
Oh yeah, I hate bad criticism. Hate it. Oh, sure.
This is just stunning to me.
Oh, everyone does.
Well, but why do you? Because, I mean, you've just said...
Because I understand to a degree the consequence of my work and what the work's about. And when people
don't get it?
No. When they ridicule, usually this is how it happens. They don't go after the work, they go after me. And they go after me and my personality, and then they bang the work. And I really find that after having worked 30 years, they should get off it. I mean, at a very young age, I developed a certain kind of signature as a person, and I wish people would give it up. I mean, after a point, it gets very tiresome.
What do you think the signature was?
Aggressive, obstinate, macho MF.
Right.
And it's hard to outgrow that. And maybe it's true. I mean, you know, Genet said, look, everything anyone ever said about you is probably true. Not because it's true, but because they said it. But it's difficult that people's avenue to your work becomes first about your personality, not about your work. And for that reason, I really ducked putting my face up front. I really wanted people to deal with the work and not with my personality. My personality is my personality. I'm not a movie star. I'm not interested in my personality being out there. The 80s really turned a lot of artists who misread Warhol into movie stars. That's never been my interest. I really want to be respected, and I've always wanted to be respected for my work, not for my personality. And I think, actually, it's helped to preserve my person and my work because I've been outside of the mainstream of consumption. I mean, if you ask a lot of people who Richard Serra, what his face looks like, they won't know, and that's very well and good for me, with me. I would
not only that, but they would also say he's all the things you said.
Yes,
you know?
Yes.
Well, but that can be changed.
You're going to do it, Charlie. More power to you.
Let me back up from that, because this is, you know, it's hard because there's been an evolution and because we've talked about space and this sort of awakening to the idea of space and experiencing object and space. Why steel?
I think materials have to do with sensibilities. And I think a choice of material has to do with one's sensibility. Now, some people like to work in clay, some people like to work in plaster, some people like to work in bronze, some people like the color red. The notion of a material that you respond to, that you think that you can extend yourself to, becomes an extension of who you are. How one selects a material has a lot to do with what one knows about a material.
Familiarity.
And the potential for it. And I, at a very young age, even though I never thought I would use steel to make sculpture, never even, because it was a traditional material I didn't want to get near, I understood it. And I realized I understood it in a way that it hadn't been used. So I had no reservation about going in and picking up a big 4 or 5 ton plate. I understood you could do something with it. I wasn't picking it up just because I thought it was heavy. I was picking it up because I thought I could make it light, because I could do something with it that other people hadn't done before, that I could move people through it in a way other people hadn't moved people before.
Is there anything about steel that is limiting for you?
Not right now.
Nothing?
No.
There's no vision, no creation, no...
I wish I could get bigger plate, if that's what you mean. Now, then you get into another proposition. You could probably make one longer. You say, why doesn't this guy construct one with the other? I'm not interested in welding one on top of the other. I'm not interested in constructing or framing up. I'm interested in the logic of the proposition of dealing...
Because you're not interested in...
I'm dealing with single units for the most part.
Because it's pure? Because what?
For me, it's pure, yes. Look, and it doesn't enter into the realm of architecture in that way, and I can control it. As soon as you start adding pieces on, as soon as you have assemblies, as soon as you have other parts, you get away from the logic of the proposition to control those means for an end, not for the logic of the needs for what you're dealing with. So a lot of architects deal with tectonics for tectonic's sake. And you can see buildings that are that. They're overbuilt to make the building look interesting for its own tectonics. Or they deal with the scenography of the building for its picture-making potential. If you're dealing with art, you're dealing with the potential for sculpture for a different kind of sake of space. And that's a very, very refined thing to do. You have to draw better than architects, for one thing. You do.
You're a better drawer than Frank Gehry?
Sorry, Frank, I think so. Oh, for sure. He'd even admit that.
He would.
Oh, I draw better in my sculpture than he draws in his architecture.
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons there is that he's not interested in the final detailing. He's interested in a broader scheme of things. He's interested in connections. He's interested in circulations. We come at the situation in very different ways. I'll tell you this. For the most part, what architects have always done is they use the most progressive art of the time for their own ends. And they get more applaud for it because the culture gives them more honor and prestige because their signs and symbols are more apparent. But most of what you see in architecture are watered down ideas of sculptors who have come before.
But you're talking about a man here who built a building with a space with you in mind. How little appreciation we have here.
No. Frank's a friend of mine, but don't for 1 minute think he built that space with me in mind. He built that big open space that could house one of my pieces. But
yes, of course he did.
I mean, that's like, you know, I'll throw Richard a bone here. I mean, I don't think he built that space with me in mind. He's built that space with Frank Gehry in mind. It's not that they had my sculpture.
Well, I mean, I think you should be appreciative of the fact that all these architects are saying...
Yeah, I should be appreciative, yeah.
Well, you have a lot more respect for sculptors than you do architects.
For sure. Absolutely.
I mean, architects are not even artists as far as you're concerned.
For the most... Absolutely not.
Because?
Are you going to tell me buildings are works of art?
Yes.
Oh, so are people then, and so we have...
No. Are you saying to me that Frank Lloyd Wright never created a single work of art? Whether it's furniture, whether it's...
Oh, furniture's art now. Tree, how about plum... you know, where do you want to stop?
Well, I don't know, but
Art is purposely useless. And that's what makes it more free than buildings.
Okay, but is the difference then?
Look, there are aspects in buildings that you can say deal with the provenance of sculpture or deal with the overlay of painting. But don't start telling me buildings are works of art, because I don't buy it. What
Great cathedrals that have survived have nothing to do with art.
No, they have something to do with religion, and they have something to do with social context of the time, and they have something to do with keeping people under a certain kind of moral imperative about transcendence and God, but they have nothing to do with the nature of what art has always been. I think architects right now, and I had a big talk with Norm Foster yesterday, understand that there's crossover references to architecture, but basically I'm dealing with a sculptural language and sculptural space. It happens to challenge those architects because it's dealing with spaces and places in a way that they could not have foreseen or have not accomplished yet. But it's not architecture, and Foster would be the first one to tell you so. And so would Frank Gehry. If you really pinned Frank down and said, hey, what's the distinction, Frank, between you as an architect and Don Judd, right? Frank is parading right now, and so are all of these mouthpiece critics that, you know, support him as, quote, the artist. Oh, the mad artist, right? The architect as artist. Hogwash. Don't believe it, don't buy it. And I don't think society should buy it either. And I like Frank. He's a good friend of mine. But I understand the distinction between what I do and what he does, and so does he.
All right. So here we go. You brought me here to this point in this conversation. Tilted Arc.
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah.
What did it do to you?
It blew a lot of time for me, I'll tell you that.
Many people first became aware of Richard Serra in the 1980s. Commissioned by the government, he installed Tilted Arc in Lower Manhattan. The piece and Serra were attacked as aggressive and austere. Serra was forced into the debate to support his art. After fierce arguments, the piece was removed. It was the first time in history the government dismantled a piece of art it had commissioned.
It made me think that there's a world of politics out there that has nothing to do with art, that can use you as fodder and change people's beliefs and who you are and what you're doing merely by distorting information. You try suing the federal government for $30 million if you're an artist and see where you get. The government had never destroyed a work of art that they had commissioned before then. They lied, they distorted the hearing. I was set up in a kangaroo court. The day of the hearing, as many people in that building came out for the piece or against the piece. Whether that should have even been the proposition, I don't know. Whether we should have people voting on whether they like the work of art or not. The next day, the government came out and said, the people of this building has declared that they want this piece out of the building. That was a lie. I phoned up and said, hey, they said, you correct it. Did I have any, did I have a venue to the press? No. They used me because they wanted to change the administration policies of art and architecture. They wanted art that affirmed their principles of enhancement. They wanted decor that they could understand. They weren't interested in the language of art. Not at all, and they never will be. Why would one think that? I think that if you're trying to break new ground, there's a hostility that surrounds you because people who you've moved away from resent the fact that you're doing something that's kind of taboo. So I think in order to persevere, you have to be obstinate, you have to be marginalized, you probably have to stay away from, depends on your personality, a certain aspect of the sociability of the art world, because I think finally what happens to a lot of very, very young artists...
Sociability meaning what? Parties?
Well, I think art is what we do, culture is what's done to us. And art is what we make, but culture does something else to artists, and it pretty much eats them up like popcorn. And it doesn't have too high of respect for them. If I asked, well, we've been talking about, but if I asked you to name 3 architects or 3 film directors or 3 politicians or 3 composers or whatever, you could probably do it like that. If I said name 3 living contemporary sculptors, you'd probably have to scratch your head.
And what?
Because it's not part of the dialogue that you and I in the world of consumerism deals with. So it's another kind of language. It's always taken more time. It's always been ridiculed. It's heavy to move around. It's difficult to deal with. It's not like taking a photograph and making 30 of them and getting them out all over the world simultaneously. It's not a easily supportable market commodity. So you have to have also another belief in the potential of sculpture and what you're up to.
And what is your belief in the potential of sculpture?
To change how people see and how they think. And how they see...
About the world, about themselves, about...
Look, I don't think it's a big change, but I think it's a catalyst for a perceptual change. And if you can change how people think when they walk into and through in a space, and you can evoke feelings that they haven't had before, and you can challenge their preconceived notions about what containment in space is, what release in space is, what passing through space is, or whatever, I think that's a worthwhile thing to do. I don't think it's going to change the world, but I think that it gives different people a different aspect of potential for viewing the world.
You think any art's going to change the world?
Hard to know.
Or any book or anything else?
I think cultures change the world, and I think people fight for...
Ideas change the world.
Ideas change the world, and I think cultures are involved with ideas and the sustainment of ideas, and artists contribute to those sustaining ideas But I don't think any one art ever changed the world. The idea that Guernica had anything to do with the war is hogwash. I mean, no bombs were ever stopped because of Guernica. I mean, we can go to it now and say, oh, look at this great painting.
Yeah.
And
he showed us the horror of
He showed us
war.
the horror of the war, but it didn't prevent any bombs from falling.
Is sculpture gaining, losing, holding its own in an appreciation by, you know, the cultural public?
I don't know. I don't know. It's hard to know. I just know that we've had, you know, a lot of people have been looking at this work, which is gratifying, and it may be useful and helpful for younger sculptors to understand that that's possible, that there can be an audience for sculpture. I think for a while there wasn't. To regenerate sculpture, particularly the kind of sculpture I'm involved with, to think at the end of the 20th century someone could have pumped some life back into steel sculpture, not a long shot. I mean, a long shot because it seemed like a dinosaur. It seemed like everything had been done there. It seemed like, you know, the field had been closed, and it just took a certain persistence to open that up again. And maybe younger people will find that helpful and useful, and that can happen.
On September 11th, you were here in this building that we sit in now, which is close to Ground Zero.
Yeah, saw it all. Plane came right over my house. Saw it right from the window. Saw the underbelly side of it. Saw the wing tip down and thought that it was going to straighten out. Saw the pilot pull, didn't see the pilot, but saw the plane pull up and then direct itself right toward the center of the building, upper center of the building. Saw the explosion, saw the fireball, saw the fire suck back in, saw the black cavern, saw the tail section still burning down to an ash, and then went down on the street, Alan and I. Saw people jumping, just very horrific. Went over to Hudson Street, saw the fire come through, didn't see the plane hit, saw the fire come through the other building, and then I found myself on the street yelling attack. I never thought that would happen. Someone in front of me yelled attack, and I yelled attack, running back, came here. A woman worked with Trina is here now. We were upstairs. I went to look out the other window. She was looking out the window. Building came down right in front of us. Put three leashes on one dog. I was so nervous. Got down to the street, got out, started walking up Hudson Street. The other building came down. Nightmares for weeks. We stayed here, and I wanted to stay. I mean, there was a lot to do. There was a kind of cohesiveness in the neighborhood that if you didn't talk to your neighbors before, you certainly did then. There were just things to be aware of, to keep together. I mean, for a while, we couldn't leave here because we thought we wouldn't get back in. You know, you had to have an ID card. And so maybe the first 3 or 4 days we had no electricity. I think for me, the thing that was the most sad was to watch people jump. That was really horrifying. I mean, I can't even tell you how horrifying that was.
You saw it in nightmares.
Yeah. For weeks. I'm okay now, but for weeks.
Will it in any way have an influence on the work you do?
People have asked me that. Not directly. I think the interpretation of work will change. People's interpretation of other people's work will change, and probably people will have a lot less patience with work they find frivolous. I think there'll be a need for Hollywood and diversion, which isn't the kind of art I'm involved with, if you want to even call it whatever you want to call it, but there'll be a big need for that. But I think there'll be another respect for serious work. I think serious people will take serious work more serious, and I think work that is frivolous will look frivolous. So I think there'll be it's kind of a marker.